So, some of you out there have asked me to give you some ideas for what to do if you have a concept but no story. That's great. The fact that you have a concept, the fact that you have something you want to talk about is great, something you feel something about. So what to do if you don't really know how to tell a story about it? The first thing is to generate lots and lots of information about your story so that you can pick and choose and build a story from it. The narrative is sort of starts to work itself out after you have enough objects, materials, people, places to work with. So the first thing I want to talk to you about is brainstorming. And I know this might seem kind of simple, might seem like you've done brainstorming since you were in 6th grade. Well, this is a very particular kind of brainstorming. Like most brainstorming, it's based on the idea of association, right? Kind of free association, but you're associating something around a very specific item. So let's say you want to write a story about poetry. Poetry means a lot to you and you really dig it. So you want to write a story about it. Okay, so that's your concept, but you don't have a story. So let's start thinking about the way that poetry fits into your life, right? This has to be your story. So we're going to start brainstorming. We're going to start associating all the things we can with in our lives with poetry. So there are two ways I'm going to explain to you to do this. The first has to do with timed lists for brainstorming. Now, what you want to do is you want to come up with an amount of time that you think would be good for you to write down everything you can associate with your subject. So maybe you're thinking, well, I think 90 seconds is kind of a long time to just be writing down little items. So I'm going to go ahead and give myself 90 seconds. Okay, that's good, but double that. Give yourself 3 minutes instead of a minute and a half. And then go for it. And once you start, don't stop. And maybe at 90 seconds, if you were right, you start to slow down and you start to say, well, I've made all these, I've come up with people that I associate with poetry and places in my life and objects and events and habits that I've developed around poetry, attitudes that I have about poetry, all of these things but now I'm starting to run out. But I've still got 90 seconds to go. That's perfect. Keep going. Stretch it. Maybe things that do associate, maybe that don't. Maybe things that just pop into your head. Write them down. Get on to the next one. Something comes in, write it down, get on to the next one. It's about energy. It's about not wasting too much time evaluating what you put down. And then at the end of those 3 minutes, hopefully you were really struggling by the end. If you weren't really struggling by the end, you probably didn't do it long enough. Keep going. Keep going until you really start to struggle, and then give yourself another minute to struggle through. The idea is that when you really start to struggle, that's when you're starting to make associations that don't come easily, that aren't immediately obvious. What's obvious to you tends to be obvious for your readers, and that tends not to make for a very interesting story. So it's always what happens at the end of your list. The items that were harder to come up with, that were less expected, that were less obvious. So that's the first part of the timed lists. That's the first way of brainstorming. The second way of brainstorming I want to talk to you about is very similar. It has to do, instead of a certain amount of time that's going to really stretch you out, we're going to have a certain amount of entries that stretch you out. Let's say you want to come up with 50 things you associate with poetry, right? 50 people, places, objects, events, habits, stuff like that. And you think 50 is a good number, come up with 100. Really. Or maybe you give yourself, you start out and you list everything you know, and then you add 25 to, no matter where you are when you start to run out of ideas, give yourself an additional 25 and make yourself fill that in. Don't stop. You can get completely ridiculous. You can start telling yourself the names of different poems, or quoting yourself lines, or poets, or people that you wish wrote poetry, or anything, really anything. Get to the end of your list, because it's at the end of the list where most often you're going to find the stuff that's really interesting, kind of unexpected, and items that you can actually explore, things you can actually learn from doing this assignment. Learn from yourself, learn about yourself, learn about your topic, and that is really fascinating to watch as an audience. to watch somebody work through something that they don't already understand. Sort of like I'm doing here. I'm kind of making this up as I go. Well, at least doing this about poetry. So that's a way to generate two very, very productive kind of lists. And the next step beyond that, I would say, is to take a look at your items on your list. Maybe pick a couple, put them into conversation with each other, juxtapose them, compare and contrast, see what sorts of energy there is between them. Or you can pick one item on that list and go through this process again. Like maybe you had poetry and then you had the public library from when you were a child. Okay, so now, instead of writing about poetry, now you're writing about the public library from your small hometown in North Dakota, which is where my small hometown poetry library was. So then I would start off again. I would brainstorm. I would say, okay, I'm going to come up with 50 things that, because it was a long time ago, I could probably come up with 25 things I associate easily. I'm going to double that, go to 50, and go. And then I would start going, and then I would realize that here's a whole bunch of really specific stuff that I could talk about this library when I would really be talking about the way poetry functions in my life now. And that it wouldn't end up becoming your whole story, but it might end up helping you understand at least a part of your story. So, and you can cycle through this as many times as you want. You can have those initial lists and maybe you see 3 items that you think are interesting. So you repeat the process for each of those 3 items. And then one of those items becomes really interesting to you. So you look at your list that you created for that item, you pick out a couple more items, and you just keep following until you've gained enough of an understanding and you've got enough material working in your working memory that you can start to actually construct a story, which is what we're going to talk about in part 2 of this lesson, where we start to learn to tell the story of an object, or looking at an object, looking at a person, looking at a place, and pulling a story out of that. Not necessarily to be your overall story, but to at least to help you understand how one story intersects with another story and how that can be a really useful and interesting storytelling tool.